I was asked just in this first session to perhaps set the scene a little bit broader. What are we seeing in the wider world of media and advertising? What are the key challenges facing boardrooms? And potentially then how does that reflect back in some of the industry challenges that you face within this industry? I'm sure you'll know PwC is one of the largest professional services groups in the world. There are almost 200,000 people here. So we consult to many industries, not just media. But just picking up on a few of the key messages from what we include within our flagship publication, which is the Entertainment and Media Outlook. You can download this online from our website. It's pwc.com/outlook. And you can see a number of the figures I'll quote from it are taken from this publication, which looks at different media sectors and tries to draw on some key trends. But I thought I'd look back. We publish this once a year. We publish it independently. So this was what we said in June would be some of the key challenges facing marketers going forward over the next 5 years. Firstly, there's a really important challenge on demographics. In the world globally, but also even in countries like the UK, the growing younger demographic just simply consume media, watch media in very different ways. Much less live TV, much more online, VOD, etc., through mobiles. And so reaching that demographic means advertisers essentially having to work harder and try new things. Secondly, we have this view, again, it's often, it's a phrase often used, content is king, but it's worth just bearing in mind that today the content isn't just what else is scheduled or released in a publication that week that competes with your content. It's in many ways almost all the other content that's ever been published, if you think of the back catalogues of OTT or what you can get online. So the sort of nature of competition within content has changed very dramatically. There's changing access, more and more consumers on the move, consuming through multiple devices. There's many markets are themselves very, very high growth, given their rising incomes and rising populations. And then the fifth trend we pulled out was about business models need to transform with trust. There have been many issues that we've seen in terms of a loss of trust, be it a sort of misuse of data or essentially the relationship breaking down between individual consumers and large corporations that we think will become an increasingly prevalent challenge for business, and something that I'll refer to in the course of this presentation I think speaks very well with some of the activities that this industry can help broker and drive. These points really then just make the next step of that journey into digital. There's really, again, a lot of change taking place. Consumers are now growing up digital natives. They're no longer of my generation, people who learned digital having been consumers of other media, be it print or television, but they're digital first, and they expect and behave in different ways to their parents' generation. Secondly, and I think we heard this on the panel, essentially data has allowed science to complement the art of marketing. So it is now very, very performance-driven, with measurement at the heart. And this is, again, something I think marketers are increasingly getting used to using. I love the phrase in the panel discussion, all marketers becoming performance marketers. Again, we see that's absolutely resonating through boardrooms. I talked about trust. I'll talk again about trust, but there is an absolute imperative to establish trust with customers to unlock growth and value. And finally, with customers increasingly on the move, there's new ways to harness power of location, get customers where they are. So just then a few numbers. We do this at PwC a lot. This is a view of the UK advertising marketplace just in 3 snapshots over time. But in 2003, I remember arguing passionately with people that that little sliver on the right-hand side, which is the totality of online marketing, could become big. And it could become maybe 15% of the market. Well, how wrong we were. If you look forward to 2 different snapshots, in 2008, around the turn of the sort of Great Recession, internet, the sort of big orange strip on the right-hand side, had grown very substantially. You still had a very big market in newspapers and TV. They were a little bit smaller than they were in relative terms, but they were still big. But you'd started to see internet as both a pure play medium in itself, and also, if you look at the bottom, the sort of orange shift is sort of working in complement with other media. So the kind of orange bar below newspapers, essentially the digital versions of newspapers, and in things like B2B magazines, it had made more progress. If you then wind forward to 2016,
we see it's not only by far in and of itself, by a long way, the biggest medium. A lot of the things that used to be a lot bigger, newspapers, magazines, etc., have been squeezed very considerably on a relative basis. But it's also incredibly complementary. So kind of the amount of those industries that are also digital has grown significantly. So they work, the magazines industry is both a printed medium and a digital medium. So we think that sort of all-powerful growth of internet has really been staggering over this period. Just then, looking forward, we still see our forecast is sort of broadly for decent growth. On the left-hand side of this chart, it's our sort of view for all UK total advertising on an annual basis up to 2016. And we created a forecast of about 5.5% just before the Brexit vote in the UK took place. We've then been sort of reflecting and have come back and moderated that somewhat. So we're still showing growth, but potentially that range between 4 to 6% is probably what we'd expect the whole market to do. The biggest part of that market is already internet advertising, and we think this will be the biggest part of the growth. So, in a way, this is very much the engine of all UK marketing spend, and we expect that to continue to grow pretty strongly. So, but really, the reasons for maybe some relative caution on this, if I sort of look through, this is a sort of long-term view of UK GDP performance, and then over on the right-hand side, just showing what a series of projections might look like. In this case, of course, nobody knows. One of the sort of pleasing features is that since the vote, the economy has generally performed better than most economists feared it would. So our sort of lowercase, scenario has been, at this stage anyway, sort of hasn't borne out. But I think we, along with most other forecasters, still expect a softening of the economy in 2017 and 2018, which of course brings some issues with it. We just try to look at, well, okay, what other signs can you see? This, again, is not a perfect measure over on the right-hand side, but if you just look at what had been happening to the sort of share prices of major media companies, that's another indication, at least in terms of sort of what the financial markets were voting might happen to media. Generally sort of trending down. There's more concerns over them. Interestingly, actually, on the two we picked just before kind of going to press, there's obviously very big news about Sky in terms of sort of potential takeovers, and that's affected some of the other stocks as well. But you've got company-specific M&A things that also drive. But generally, the trend was a sort of slow downward trend, reflecting more uncertainty in the market. So really kind of a lot of headwinds to navigate in the industry. But taking all of that into account, we still saw the growth that I talked to earlier, really driven by strong fundamentals in digital advertising. There's more time spent online. I think the data from the IAB UCOM study for January to June last year showed an average of 3 hours, 9 minutes spent online, split between desktop, 41%, mobile now the biggest share, 45%, and tablet, 15%. So really sort of, because there's so much time being spent online, it is the environment in which to reach audiences and potentially drive transactions. The ease of transactions is increasing. There's a continued need for marketers, of course, to sort of find the right messages in this rather cluttered environment. But kind of fundamentally, we think this is often you hear about technology disruption. In this industry, technology has been, of course, the disruptor to other industries. It continues to disrupt itself. But fundamentally, if we particularly talk about performance affiliate, this is technology enabled. And so as you get more data, more information, more insight, you could do more things with it. I think then I wanted to maybe just talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing brands and what do we see and why do we see performance affiliate working very well within this industry. So again, a marketing truism, it's all about finding the right customers at the right time with timely, relevant messages. This hasn't changed at all, but one of the things that in digital marketing we're now able to do is continually vary that message and do so quickly and do so with effectively a much tighter return or measurement of the return on the investment. I talked a little bit about trust and how potentially marketers need to think very carefully about the rules of this particular engagement. So Helen and Kevin talked earlier in the panel just about this, that kind of if we're, as brands and as an online community, as an online marketing community, we need to really think very carefully about, is the message appropriate, and are we essentially still continuing to deliver value to that audience? We talk about in our research a permission-based model, consumers seeking greater control over what they are willing to accept. We've seen in many cases the rise of ad blocking, so consumers effectively tuning out of marketing or wanting to tune out of some aspects of marketing, which is a challenge for the whole of the industry. We think fundamentally, though, consumers want to see value or relevance from their advertising. They're willing to have it. There is a study by the IAB in the US that talked about 2/3 of consumers who use ad blocking would be willing to turn them off if the industry addresses things they find most annoying. So if it's the kind of, the unexpected autoplay ads, for example, that slow down the browser, if you can manage that, then consumers are actually willing to turn off the ad blocking. And these are people who have previously effectively went to ad blocking in the first place. So we don't think it's a sort of something that can't be overcome, but it's one of the things that the industry needs to be incredibly wary of. We also talk about the greater accountability that's coming into, we see this in the boardrooms of all our clients, and I think reflected in the discussion today. But really, these themes, if you did a word cloud of the conversations in boardrooms, you hear words like this more and more often: viewability, verification, transparency. So real challenges for the whole industry, but which potentially performance marketing actually we think is pretty well placed to address.
Why do we think that? Well, we think performance marketing has a number of features which are attractive in themselves and should allow the industry to capture new growth.
Mobile, we talk about an increasingly mobile-first world. Today, we think in performance, something like 30%. That was in 2015, so obviously much more growth even in, to the current period and much more to come being served through mobile. So that being mobile complementary is a great feature of this industry. More broadly, that embrace of new technology, whether it be not just in how to reach customers through mobile, but in attribution and tracking, is bringing greater measurability, transparency, and incrementality for advertisers. So this is sort of very much technology enabled. Consumers receive direct benefits, whether it be in terms of discounts or some other value as part of that exchange. I talked about that handshake and that value exchange. That's very important to consumers. And finally, if there is a slowdown in the economy, this is one of the areas that we would expect there to be more resilience, because the core of the model, advertisers are only paying for actions that they can directly attribute and measure. So hence, if our more pessimistic scenarios on Brexit, as I showed earlier, or some other global slowdown occurs, we'd still expect this industry to be relatively more resilient. Just then, in terms of putting some numbers and some context to what Claire referred to earlier, in our last study, we talked about online performance marketing as a 1.3 billion spend directly on this industry, but with a much, much higher multiple in terms of sales generated. That in itself was growing at close to 10%. And just if you put it in context in terms of how much spend is on this industry vis-a-vis others, it's now a very large and well-established part of the marketing mix. So we think it's sort of finding its place and doing extremely well. It's also, we think, generating some really innovative models. It's attracting big brands, as those on the right-hand side. People are increasingly comfortable with using it, but some of the innovation that's going on in the sector is tremendous. I think we'll be hearing from a number of these participants today and many others. So just in terms of sort of what we see, the level of innovation and new thinking going on in this industry is extremely encouraging. Really then, just in conclusion, from our viewpoint, we only comment, our ability to measure and comment is only a function of what you all do in the industry. So the numbers that we talked about earlier are very positive because there's a tremendous amount of activity going on in this industry, which is great to see and great to be able to report on. But in our view, if you take a sort of macro view, there isn't a panic in terms of the economic outlook. We think it will probably be more difficult. There'll be more headwinds, but we're still seeing growth. And we're seeing growth will perhaps trend to the areas that are sort of most resilient and best able to show value through that downturn, for which performance and affiliates should be very well placed to do. We think just in moving forward, media just needs to be more mobile and more agile, needs to really think about what are the challenges that advertisers themselves face and what can they justify, and hence back to measurability and incrementality. Again, things that we think the industry does very well. So as a closing thought, this is clearly an area where there's a lot to play for. If you look at all of the spend that is out there, this is not only a big industry in itself today, but we think potentially well placed to capture more spend of the total advertising pot in future. I'm very much looking forward to hearing more of the perspectives from the industry. I hope that gives you a little bit of perspective for where the industry's come from and where it may potentially evolve to. Thanks very much.